Abigail Carter did not cry when her stepmother tore the blue dress from her hands and threw a faded yellowed gown at her feet. She did not cry when Margaret fastened the buttons herself slowly, deliberately, and smiled. She simply lifted her chin, walked out into the summer night, and told herself she would not break. Not tonight. Not ever. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow Abigail's journey to the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1818 came to Virginia like a held breath, finally released, thick with heat, heavy with honeysuckle, and full of the kind of tension that settles into a household where one woman holds all the power, and another woman is slowly learning what it costs to have none. Abigail Carter had been up since 4 in the morning, not because she wanted to be, not because the rooster had crowed, or because the fields needed tending. She was up because Margaret Carter, her father's widow, the woman who had moved into this house like smoke, moves into a room quietly, and then all at once had decided that the preparations for Governor Randolph's summer ball required Abigail's hands, Abigail's back, and Abigail's silence. The silk needed pressing. Margaret's silk, her 2 daughters' silk, 3 gowns that cost more than what a tobacco field worker earned in a year. Abigail pressed them all. She pressed them without complaint. She set the ribbons straight. She pinned the lace at Eleanor's collar when it came loose, and she recurled Dorothea's hair twice after the first set fell in the afternoon heat. She did all of it because this was the arrangement, unspoken, unwritten, and absolute. She lived in her father's house because Margaret allowed it. She ate at her father's table because Margaret permitted it. And she kept breathing in this life because she had not yet found a reason strong enough to fight her way out of it. Her own gown hung on the back of the door. She had made it herself 2 summers ago from fabric she had bought with money earned tutoring the Whitmore children down the road. It was blue, a deep, honest blue, the color of the James River in late evening. It wasn't silk. It wasn't trimmed in French lace. But she had sewn every stitch herself, and when she'd finished it, she had stood before the small cracked mirror in her room and felt for one brief and fragile moment like herself. She had planned to wear it tonight. Margaret had other plans. "That color," her stepmother said, appearing in the doorway of Abigail's room without knocking as she always did, "is not appropriate for a girl in your position." Abigail set down her hairbrush. "My position. A farmer's orphan attending the governor's ball as a guest of this family." Margaret's voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. That was the most frightening thing about her. "You'll draw the wrong kind of attention. People will think we dressed you poorly. It reflects on us." "Then I won't wear it. I'll stay home." The smile that crossed Margaret's face was thin and quick. "You'll come. You'll wear something suitable." She reached past Abigail, unhooked the blue dress from the door, and folded it over her arm. "I'll have this laundered for you, for another occasion." They both knew there would be no other occasion. What she left in its place was a gown Abigail had never seen before, cream-colored once, now yellowed at the collar, the hem fraying in 2 places, the fabric so worn it had gone thin at the elbows. It was old. It was someone else's. And it smelled faintly of cedar and long storage. "This was your mother's," Margaret said. "I found it in the attic. I thought it might be sentimental." It wasn't sentiment. It was strategy. And Abigail understood it completely. She held the dress for a long moment after Margaret left. She turned it over in her hands. She found the small tear near the left seam, the missing button at the back, that had been replaced with the wrong size. She understood what tonight was meant to be. A reminder. A public one. She put the dress on. She fastened every button she could reach. She fixed her hair simply parted in the center, and pinned back the way she always wore it. She had no jewelry. Her mother's pearls had disappeared 2 months after her father's funeral, and she had never asked where they went. She had no gloves that fit properly. She had a pair of her own boots, plain brown leather, sensible and solid. She walked out to the carriage and climbed in without a word. Margaret watched her with the careful attention of a woman observing the result of an experiment. The Blanchard estate sat at the edge of the governor's land, A colonial house broad and white, its windows blazing with candlelight that spilled golden across the lawn where carriages arrived in a steady stream. Music drifted out through the open doors, a fiddle and a pianoforte playing something bright and formal. The sound of voices, laughter. The particular sound of people who are very comfortable and very certain of their place in the world. Abigail stepped down from the carriage and heard the music falter. Not literally. The fiddle kept playing. But something shifted, a ripple of awareness that moved through the clusters of people near the entrance, a turning of heads, a pause in conversation. She watched it happen, the way you watch a stone drop into still water. The ring spread outward from her, and they carried whispers in their wake. Is that the Carter girl? Good Lord, what is she wearing? Does she not own a mirror? Margaret brought her. That seems rather cruel. Oh, but I suppose Margaret would know nothing about cruelty. Laughter, soft and controlled, the kind that society women deploy, like a weapon they've spent years sharpening. Abigail kept walking. She had learned somewhere in the 3 years since her father's death how to keep her face neutral. It was a survival skill. She kept her chin level. She kept her hands still at her sides. She did not look at the faces turned toward her, because she knew if she looked, she would see either pity or satisfaction, and she wasn't sure which one would be harder to bear. Margaret and her daughters moved ahead seamlessly, gracefully absorbed immediately into the current of society, like stones into warm water. They did not look back. Abigail found the edge of the room. There was a stone column near the east wall, and she positioned herself beside it, the way she'd positioned herself beside columns and door frames at every social event for 3 years. Close enough to be present, far enough to be overlooked. She watched the dancing. She watched the men in their dark coats and the women in their bright gowns. She catalogued the flowers on the mantelpiece and the cut of the chandelier and the way the candlelight caught the crystal punch glasses, and she told herself quietly and firmly that she was fine. She was fine. She was absolutely fine. Miss Carter, is it? She turned. The woman beside her was perhaps 60, with silver hair pinned high and an expression that managed to be both sharp and warm at the same time. She was small, upright, dressed in deep burgundy, with a single strand of pearls. Yes, ma'am, Abigail said. Eleanor Hawthorne. The woman extended her gloved hand. I knew your father. Robert Carter was a decent man and an honest one. I was sorry to hear of his passing. Abigail shook her hand. Thank you. You look uncomfortable. I'm perfectly fine, ma'am. You're standing against a wall at a ball. That's not fine, that's self-preservation. The older woman's eyes were direct and a little amused. Are you hiding or simply resting? Observing, Abigail said carefully. Mrs. Hawthorne glanced across the room. My son does the same thing. Observes from the edges. People mistake it for coldness. She paused. It's usually just that he sees more than other people and doesn't much care to pretend otherwise. Abigail followed her gaze. She found him immediately the way you find the still point in a moving room. He stood near the fireplace alone in the particular way that very powerful people are alone, not isolated, but separate by choice. Everyone else maintaining a careful and respectful distance. He was tall, dark-coated, with the weathered look of a man who spent more time on horseback than in parlors, despite the parlors clearly knowing his name. He was speaking to no one. He was watching the room with the flat, calm attention of a man who had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. That's your son? Abigail asked. Nathaniel, Mrs. Hawthorne said. 34 years old, widower, richest man in 3 counties and absolutely determined to be miserable about it. She said it without cruelty, with the particular fond exasperation of a mother who has watched her child make the same mistake for a long time. He'll be leaving in an hour. He always leaves early. Says these events are a waste of good evening. He doesn't enjoy them. He endures them. There's a difference. She looked at Abigail with that sharp, warm gaze. You're the same, I think. You endure. Abigail didn't answer. It wasn't a question. It was Eleanor Dorsey who escalated things. Eleanor Dorsey was 22 and engaged to a tobacco merchant, and absolutely convinced that both of these facts made her the most important person at any gathering. She arrived at Abigail's column with her two closest friends flanking her like a particularly well-dressed military formation, and she looked at Abigail's gown with the unguarded delight of someone who has just found exactly the target they were looking for. "Oh," Eleanor said, not "oh" of surprise, "oh" of satisfaction. "Miss Carter, I almost didn't recognize you." She tilted her head. "Is that dress? Is that a vintage cut? I don't think I've seen that silhouette since my grandmother's portrait." Her friends laughed the way they had clearly practiced. "It was my mother's," Abigail said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "How touching," Eleanor said. "Sentimental. Though I suppose when you can't afford new things, sentiment becomes rather convenient." "Eleanor." The warning came from her companion, a girl named Lucy, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'm simply making conversation." Eleanor's smile widened. "Tell me, Miss Carter, does your stepmother know you came dressed this way? I'd think she'd be mortified." "My stepmother chose the dress." The silence that followed was brief and pointed. Eleanor recovered quickly. "Well," she said, "that explains it, I suppose." She looked at her friends. They looked at each other. And the three of them turned away with a collective rustling of proper silk, leaving behind them the clear and deliberate impression of a conversation that hadn't been worth having. Abigail turned back to the column. She pressed her palm flat against the stone. She counted the threads in the lace of the woman passing in front of her. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and told herself that it didn't matter, that none of it mattered, that she had endured worse in the quiet of her own kitchen, and she could endure this in the bright noise of a ballroom. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry in the middle of the governor's summer ball in a dress that smelled like cedar and humiliation. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes stung. She focused on the chandelier. "Miss Carter." The voice was low. Not a drawl exactly, but a voice with space in it. Unhurried, the voice of a man who never needed to raise it to be heard. She turned, and Nathaniel Hawthorne was standing 3 feet from her. Up close, he was more human than she'd expected. There was a tiredness around his eyes, something worn into the lines of his face that had nothing to do with age. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately identify. Not pity. Not the considering look men sometimes gave women they were assessing. Something quieter than either of those things. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "I believe we haven't been formally introduced." He didn't extend his hand the way men usually did, with a slight performative quality, the social ritual wearing itself plainly. He just stood there, direct and still. "My mother mentioned your name." "She's very kind." "She's very honest." There's a difference. Something shifted in his expression, almost barely a ghost of a wry acknowledgement. "She said your father was a good man." "He was. I thought so too. I did business with him twice before he passed. He was straightforward, and he kept his word." He paused. "I was sorry to hear of his death." "Thank you." They stood for a moment in the particular quiet that exists in loud rooms when two people have stopped paying attention to the noise. Then Nathaniel Hawthorne said, "Would you honor me with this dance, Miss Carter?" She looked at him. She looked at the room, at the heads already beginning to turn, at Eleanor Dorsey, 3 feet away, with her mouth slightly open, at Margaret, visible across the crowded floor, who had gone very still in a way that meant she was watching and calculating. She looked back at Nathaniel. "Why?" she asked. It wasn't the response he'd expected. She could see that. Most women wouldn't ask. Most women would simply accept, pleased and flustered, and let themselves be led onto the floor. He studied her for a moment. Then something in his face settled like a decision being made quietly. "Because," he said, "the music's good. And you're the only person in this room who looks like they're actually thinking something worth thinking." Abigail Carter looked at this man, this tired, serious, unexpectedly direct man, and she made a decision of her own. "All right," she said. She took his hand, And when Nathaniel Hawthorne led Abigail Carter onto the floor of Governor Randolph's summer ball, the room did not simply turn to look. It stopped. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. The fiddle played on. The candlelight fell the same as it always had. But something had shifted in the architecture of the evening, some fundamental rearrangement of who mattered and who was watching and why. Margaret Carter stood at the edge of the floor with a glass of punch in her hand, and her face held the careful, practiced expression of a woman who had planned something very thoroughly and was now watching it come apart at the seams. Abigail felt the gown, the faded, wrong-colored, deliberate gown, and she felt the eyes on her, and she kept her chin level and her back straight and her hand steady in the hand of a man who danced the way he did everything else. It seemed without performance, without unnecessary flourish, simply and with full attention. "You're angry," he said, not a question, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I'm fine," she said. "You said that to my mother, too." He looked at her directly. "She said you were lying then also." Abigail almost laughed. It surprised her, the sudden upward pressure of it in her chest, the way it nearly escaped before she caught it. "Your mother," she said, "is very perceptive." "Yes," he agreed. "It's inconvenient." He turned them smoothly at the edge of the floor. "The dress," he said, without looking at it, without making it a point of attention. "That was deliberate." She didn't answer. "Not by you," he said. "By someone else." She looked at him. "You noticed." "I notice things," he said simply. "It's a habit." The music moved through them. The room watched. Abigail held her back straight and let herself for one song stop pretending she was fine with being invisible. Because here in the center of this floor, in this worn and faded dress, with this man who noticed things, she was the opposite of invisible. And Margaret Carter, watching from the edge of the room, understood for the first time that tonight had not gone the way she'd planned. Not even close. The dance ended, and the applause that followed was polite in the way that Virginia society was always polite, surface smooth, underneath churning, with everything people were too well bred to say out loud. Nathaniel released her hand. He stepped back exactly the correct distance. He inclined his head in the formal way, but his eyes stayed on her face a beat longer than formality required, and then he said quietly, "Thank you for the dance, Miss Carter," and walked back toward the edge of the room. Abigail stood in the center of the floor for exactly 3 seconds before she made herself move. 3 seconds was long enough. The room had seen. The room had catalogued. The room was already sorting the evening into the version it would tell at breakfast tomorrow, and she had no control over that version. So she walked back toward her column and told herself it didn't matter what they said. What she hadn't anticipated was Eleanor Dorsey waiting for her. "Well," Eleanor said. Her voice had changed, the bright mockery gone, replaced with something colder and more considered. "That was unexpected." "Was it?" Abigail said. "Nathaniel Hawthorne hasn't danced with anyone in 2 years." Eleanor looked at her with the direct calculation of a woman who has just realized she underestimated something. "Not since Caroline died. He doesn't dance. He doesn't call. He barely attends these events at all." She paused, letting that settle. "And tonight he crossed a room full of women who have been trying to get his attention for 2 years to ask you." Abigail said nothing. "I'm curious what you said to him," Eleanor said. "Nothing remarkable." "Clearly you said something." Eleanor's eyes moved over her, the dress, the plain hair, the boots, with the systematic thoroughness of a woman recalibrating. "Or perhaps you didn't say anything at all. Perhaps that was the point." She tilted her head. "Be careful, Miss Carter. Men like Nathaniel Hawthorne don't ask girls like you to dance out of affection. They do it out of principle, or pity, or both." "Thank you for the warning," Abigail said evenly. "I mean it kindly." "I know you do," Abigail said and turned away. She didn't believe for a single moment that Eleanor meant it kindly. But the words followed her anyway, the way words do when they land on ground that's already soft principle, or pity. And she pressed her palm against the stone column and made herself breathe. Across the room she could see Margaret watching her. Her stepmother's face was arranged in its usual pleasant configuration, but her eyes were sharp and still, and Abigail knew that expression. She had catalogued it over 3 years. It was the expression Margaret wore when she was thinking fast and adjusting her plans. That more than anything Eleanor had said sent a slow chill down Abigail's spine. The carriage ride home was silent in the particular way that Margaret's silences were always intentional. Dorothea fell asleep against the window before they'd cleared the estate gate. Eleanor, her daughter, not the Dorsey girl, was already reviewing the evening in whispered conversation with herself, cataloging who had worn what, and who had spoken to whom. Margaret sat straight backed across from Abigail and looked out at the dark passing road. She didn't say a word until they turned onto the lane that led to the house. Then, without looking away from the window, "Don't mistake one dance for something it isn't." Abigail kept her hands folded in her lap. "I don't know what you mean. Nathaniel Hawthorne is a grieving man with too much money and too much time to be eccentric." Margaret's voice was conversational, reasonable. The voice she used when she was saying something that she wanted to sound like advice, but was actually a fence being built. "He does unexpected things sometimes. It means nothing. By next week he won't remember your name." "All right," Abigail said. "You embarrassed this family tonight." The shift was so quick that Abigail's breath caught before she could stop it. "I beg your pardon." Standing against that wall for half the evening like you were waiting for a carriage. People noticed. People commented. Margaret finally looked at her. "I brought you to this event as a courtesy. You made us look like we couldn't manage our own household." The injustice of it was so complete, so perfectly constructed, that Abigail almost laughed again. The same upward pressure she'd felt on the dance floor, but darker now, and without any warmth in it. Margaret had put her in that dress. Margaret had positioned her for humiliation. And now Margaret was reframing the entire evening as Abigail's failure. "I'll do better next time," Abigail said. She said it the way she always said it, quietly, without inflection, the verbal equivalent of closing a door. Margaret watched her for a moment longer, then turned back to the window. The house came into view dark, except for the kitchen lamp that Nell, their housekeeper, always left burning. Abigail stepped down from the carriage before the footman had fully lowered. The step walked inside, went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and finally let herself feel the weight of the evening. Not the dance. Not Nathaniel Hawthorne's unexpected, unsettling directness. Not Eleanor Dorsey's cold recalibration. She sat with the weight of the dress still on her back, and thought about her father, which was what she always came back to at the end of hard days. Robert Carter, who had been straightforward and kept his word, who had danced with her mother on the back porch in the summer evenings when he thought no one was watching, who had told her once when she was perhaps 12 years old and crying over some small injustice she couldn't now remember, "Abigail, the world will try to convince you that endurance is the same as acceptance. Don't let it." She hadn't fully understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. 3 days passed. On the morning of the 4th day, a note arrived. It was delivered by a boy she didn't recognize riding a horse. She very much did. A tall bay with the Hawthorne brand on his flank. The note was written on heavy cream paper in a hand that was direct and economical, like the man himself. "Miss Carter, my mother would like to extend an invitation for tea on Thursday afternoon if you're willing. No obligation. N. Hawthorne." Abigail read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her apron, and she went back to the butter she had been churning, and she thought about it for the rest of the morning. She had not told anyone about the dance. She hadn't needed to. Margaret had clearly witnessed enough of it to form her own conclusions, and those conclusions had produced 3 days of pointed silences and extra tasks, and the particular domestic Cold War that Margaret deployed whenever she felt her position was being threatened. The laundry had needed redoing. The accounts had needed reviewing. Abigail had been occupied from before dawn to well after supper each evening, and she understood clearly that this was not coincidence. She sent her reply with the same boy when he came back for an answer that afternoon. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I would be honored. Thursday suits me well. Sinte, Carter. She did not ask Margaret's permission. This was the first time in 3 years she had not asked Margaret's permission for something. It felt like stepping off a step she hadn't known was there, a small drop, a quick catch of breath, and then solid ground beneath her feet. The Hawthorne house was older than the Carter property, and larger, a Georgian colonial set back from the road behind an avenue of old oaks that made the lane into a kind of tunnel, cool and green, even in the July heat. Abigail arrived in the small gig she drove herself, another first, another deliberate choice, and was met at the door by a housekeeper, who showed her through to the side parlor, where Eleanor Hawthorne was already seated, with the tea things arranged, and waiting. "Sit down, child," Mrs. Hawthorne said, not unkindly. "You look like you're expecting an ambush." "I'm simply not sure what this is," Abigail admitted, sitting. "It's tea." Mrs. Hawthorne poured without ceremony. "I'm 71 years old, and I've stopped dressing things up as anything other than what they are. I wanted to talk to you, so I invited you." She handed Abigail a cup. "Your father's estate. What's left of it?" Abigail blinked. "Ma'am, I'm not prying out of nosiness. I'm prying because I knew Robert Carter, and I know what that land was worth, and I'm wondering whether his widow has managed it sensibly." Her eyes were direct over the rim of her own cup. "I also know Margaret Whitfield before she was Margaret Carter, and I know what kind of woman she is." The silence that followed was careful on Abigail's side. "The estate is managed well," she said finally. "By Margaret, primarily." Mrs. Hawthorne set down her cup. "And what do you do on that estate?" "Whatever is needed." "That's not an answer. That's a deflection." The older woman looked at her without any particular judgment, just directness. "I'll ask you plainly. Do you have any legal claim to your father's property, or did he leave everything to his widow outright?" Something tightened in Abigail's chest. "I'd rather not discuss my family's legal arrangements, ma'am." "Fair enough." Mrs. Hawthorne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My son asked about you." The tightening moved up into Abigail's throat. "Did he?" "He doesn't ask about people. In 2 years since Caroline passed, he has not asked me about a single person." She looked at Abigail steadily. "He asked whether I knew anything about the Carter family's situation. Whether Robert Carter had any debt when he died. Whether his widow was the kind of woman who managed things properly, or the kind who managed things for her own benefit." Abigail sat very still. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know the details, which is true." Mrs. Hawthorne tilted her head. "But I told him I intended to find out, which is why you're here." A sound came from the doorway. Nathaniel Hawthorne stood there with his hat in his hand, looking exactly as surprised to see her as she was to see him, which meant either Mrs. Hawthorne had arranged this deliberately, or he had genuinely not known she was coming, and from the brief flash of something across his face before he composed it, she suspected the latter. "Nathaniel," his mother said serenely. "Come, have tea." "You didn't mention," he began. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." A beat of silence in which Abigail watched Nathaniel Hawthorne look at his mother with the expression of a man who has long since made his peace with being outmaneuvered and has merely decided to be philosophical about it. He came in and sat down, and his mother poured him tea with the same unhurried certainty with which she did everything. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "I apologize if—" "Don't apologize," she said. "It's all right." He looked at her for a moment, then the corner of his mouth moved barely, almost imperceptibly. "My mother does this sometimes. Engineers situations. Decides that other people's awkwardness is less important than her objectives. Yes." "I heard that," Mrs. Hawthorne said pleasantly. "You were meant to," he said. What happened over the next hour was not what Abigail had expected, and she had not expected much. She had expected politeness. She had expected the careful social performance of people feeling each other out across a table. She had expected to be assessed and weighed and found either suitable or wanting for purposes she hadn't been told. Instead, they talked. Not about the estate, though. Mrs. Hawthorne circled back to questions about tobacco yields and land management, with the persistence of someone who had once run a significant farm operation herself. Not about the ball, though it existed in the room with them, the memory of it, the dance, and what it had cost her, and what it might have meant. They talked about books Nathaniel. It turned out read voraciously, and had opinions about everything. He read strong and specific opinions that he held without apology, and about the effects of the 1812 war on the Virginia trade routes, and about what the summer heat was doing to the autumn tobacco crop. And at some point, Abigail stopped performing composure and simply started talking, because he was the kind of person who made you want to say the thing you actually thought instead of the safer, smoother version of it. "You don't agree with me," he said at one point, watching her face. "I think you're right about the tariffs," she said carefully. "But I think you're underestimating what it means for smaller operations. You're thinking from the position of a man who can absorb a bad year. My father couldn't absorb 2 bad years in a row, and he wasn't foolish. He was simply working with less room for error." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair point," he said. She blinked. She hadn't expected him to just agree. Men of his position didn't usually agree with a woman who'd pushed back on them. They explained. They clarified. They found a diplomatic way to explain why her view was touching but misinformed. He just said, "That's a fair point," and looked at her like he was actually thinking about it. Mrs. Hawthorne was smiling into her teacup. Abigail left an hour later than she'd planned. She drove home in the summer evening with the windows of the gig open and the air moving through her hair, and she felt for the first time in a long time like someone who had had a real conversation. Not a managed one, not a performed one, a real one. She was halfway up the lane to the house when she realized she had not thought about the dress once the entire afternoon. Margaret was waiting in the front hall. Not coincidentally, not incidentally. She was standing in the front hall with her hands folded and her face arranged in an expression that Abigail had never quite seen before, something under the pleasantness moving beneath it, like water moving under ice. "Where have you been?" Margaret asked. "I had a tea engagement," Abigail said. She set down her gloves on the hall table. "With whom?" She looked at her stepmother. "Eleanor Hawthorne." The ice cracked. Not visibly, Margaret's face didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, something fast and cold, and Abigail felt it across the distance between them like a change in air pressure before a storm. "I see," Margaret said. "Is there a concern?" Abigail asked. She kept her voice neutral. She kept her hands still. "No concern." The pleasantness reassembled itself. "I simply like to know where members of this household spend their time. It's a matter of propriety," Abigail said. "Yes, I know." She picked up her gloves again. "I'll be in my room if I'm needed." She was almost to the stairs when Margaret said behind her, "Your father had debts, Abigail." She stopped. She turned around slowly. Margaret was still standing in the middle of the hall, her hands still folded, her voice still that same reasonable conversational tone. "I don't say it to be unkind, but people will ask questions if you're associating yourself with the Hawthorne family. And when they ask questions, certain things will come out. About Robert Carter, about what he owed and to whom." She paused. "It would be embarrassing for everyone." "What debts?" Abigail asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Nothing I want to burden you with." Margaret smiled. "I've managed it. I've protected this family's name. But you should know it exists, so you understand why. Discretion is important. Why certain associations might not serve you as well as you think." Abigail looked at her stepmother for a long moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said at last. And she went upstairs. She sat on her bed in the long summer evening light, and she thought about what Margaret had just done, the precision of it, the timing of it deployed exactly when it would do the most damage, and she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been soft, that patience had kept soft for 3 years, began to harden around the edges. Her father had not been a man with debts. He had been careful, methodical, honest, to the point of stubbornness. Every person who had known him said so. Nathaniel Hawthorne had said so. Eleanor Hawthorne had said so. He had not been a man who left disaster behind him. So what was Margaret hiding? And why, after 3 years of careful management and deliberate silence, had she chosen tonight to mention it? Abigail pressed her hands flat on her knees and stared at the far wall, and understood with the slow and certain clarity of someone who has just watched a trap be set that something had changed. Not in the house, not in Margaret, in herself. She had driven herself to tea. She had said the thing she actually thought. She had watched a powerful man agree with her and not flinched from it. She had come home and walked through the front door without asking permission, and answered a question directly and held her ground in the hall. Small things, barely visible things. But Margaret had noticed. And Margaret had immediately reached for the one thing she had never deployed before, the threat of her father's name, which meant Abigail realized that Margaret was afraid. She just didn't yet know what Margaret was afraid of. But she was going to find out. The note Nathaniel sent the following Tuesday was longer than the first one. Not dramatically longer, not flowery or elaborate. He wasn't a man who used 3 words when one would serve, and he wasn't a man who dressed his intentions up in language designed to obscure them. But it was longer, and Abigail read it standing at the kitchen window in the early morning before anyone else in the house was awake, with the summer light coming in pale and cool, and she read it twice. Miss Carter, I find I would like to continue the conversation we began on Thursday if you're willing. There are matters related to the fall trade routes I'd value your perspective on. I recognize this is an unusual request. I make it anyway. N. Hawthorne. She almost smiled at that. I make it anyway. The man communicated in straight lines, and he apparently couldn't help it, even when he was trying to be careful. She wrote back before breakfast. Mr. Hawthorne, unusual requests don't trouble me. Friday if that suits. A. Carter. She folded the note and gave it to the Hawthorne boy who was waiting at the gate. And she went inside and made the breakfast and said nothing to anyone. And she spent the rest of the week aware of Margaret watching her with that same careful measuring attention that had followed her home from the ball. Whatever Margaret was weighing, Abigail didn't ask. She had learned that asking Margaret direct questions was the same as handing her a weapon. She would take the question, turn it, and hand it back, as something that made Abigail feel smaller. So she kept her face neutral and her mouth quiet, and she waited for Friday. What she didn't anticipate was what happened on Wednesday. Nell had worked for the Carter family since before Abigail was born. She was 63 years old, broad-shouldered with hands that had kneaded bread dough and set broken bones, and held Robert Carter's hand in his last hours. And she was the only person left in this house who had known Abigail's father the way Abigail had known him, not as an abstraction, not as a legal entity or a source of financial complication, but as a man who took his coffee without sugar and whistled off-key when he was happy, and sometimes sat on the back porch at night just to listen to the dark. On Wednesday morning, Nell found Abigail in the garden and stood beside her for a long moment, saying nothing, which was Nell's way of saying she had something to say that she hadn't yet decided whether to say. Abigail kept working. She had learned to let Nell come to things in her own time. I heard something, Nell said finally. Abigail pulled a weed. All right, from Bess, at the market. Bess was the Hargrove housekeeper, 3 properties down, a woman who heard everything and said most of it. Margaret was talking to a man last week, Wednesday evening after you went to bed, in your father's study. Abigail's hands slowed. She didn't stop entirely. What man? Bess didn't know him, not from around here. She only saw him leaving. She was walking home late from the Hargrove place, saw him come down the front steps. Nell paused. She said he was carrying papers, a leather satchel the kind lawyers use. Abigail sat back on her heels. A lawyer. In her father's study. At night, while she was asleep, while Margaret moved freely through the house that still bore her father's name and conducted whatever business she chose. "Has she done this before?" Abigail asked. "Not that I've seen," Nell said. "But there are nights I sleep heavy. And there are things in that house I'm not asked to be part of." She looked at Abigail with the direct particular grief of a woman who has watched something go wrong slowly and hasn't known how to stop it. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't know if it was my place." "It's your place," Abigail said quietly. "It's always been your place, Nell." The older woman nodded. She stood there another moment, then said, "Your father kept records of everything. You know that. Every contract, every ledger, every letter." A deliberate pause. "I don't know if they're still where he kept them." Abigail looked up at her. Nell was looking at the middle distance, her expression neutral, not pointing anywhere, not saying anything more. But her meaning was as clear as the morning air between them. "Thank you," Abigail said. Nell went back inside without another word. She waited until that evening. Margaret took her daughters to call on the Whitmore family after supper, which happened once a fortnight and usually lasted 2 hours. The moment the carriage rolled down the lane, Abigail went to her father's study. It was the one room in the house she avoided. Not because Margaret had forbidden it, she hadn't in so many words, but because it was the room that still smelled like him. Tobacco and leather and the particular dry smell of old paper, and it hit her every time she opened the door, like something physical, like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. She stood in the doorway for a count of 5, and then she went in. The desk was Margaret's now in practice. The papers on top were Margaret's household accounts, her correspondence a social calendar written in her precise slanted hand. But the desk itself was her father's, a heavy walnut piece, with 3 drawers on each side and a locked center drawer that Robert Carter had always kept locked, and whose key Abigail had never possessed. She went to the bookshelves first. Her father had kept his business ledgers on the second shelf from the bottom, behind a row of agricultural almanacs that he used for reference. She'd seen him go there 100 times. She pulled out the almanacs and found nothing, empty space where the ledgers had been. She ran her hand along the shelf in case something had been pushed back. Nothing. She checked the cabinet in the corner. Filed correspondence carefully ordered going back 10 years, but only up to the year of her father's marriage to Margaret 4 years ago. After that, nothing. As if Robert Carter's paper trail had simply stopped at the point when his widow took over the filing. She stood in the center of the room and breathed. Then she went to the locked center drawer. She didn't have the key, but she had grown up in this house, and she had watched her father open that drawer 1,000 times, and she knew that he kept a spare key. This was the kind of man he was, methodical, always with a backup taped to the underside of the middle shelf in the bookcase behind the dictionary. She found it exactly where she'd expected it. Her hands were steady when she fit the key into the lock. They were less steady when the drawer opened. Inside was a single document, not ledgers, not correspondence. One sheet of paper folded in thirds, unsealed. She opened it. It was a contract, dated 18 months ago, 6 months after her father's death. It bore 2 signatures, Margaret Carter, and a name she didn't recognize, a Thomas Wyndham, with a Richmond address noted beneath. The language was legal and dense, but she read slowly, and she read carefully, and what she understood by the time she finished made her sit down in her father's chair with the paper in her hands and stare at the far wall. The contract transferred controlling interest in the Carter estate's tobacco fields, not ownership, but management rights to a business partnership represented by Thomas Wyndham. In exchange, Margaret received a fixed quarterly income. The fields were her father's legacy. They were supposed to pass to Abigail upon her majority or marriage according to the original will. She knew this. She'd been told this by her father directly, though she had never seen the will itself. This contract effectively circumvented that, and it bore a notary seal dated 3 days after the midnight meeting with the lawyer Nell had described. She put the contract back. She locked the drawer. She replaced the key. She straightened everything on the shelves until the room looked exactly as she'd found it, And then she went upstairs to her room and sat in the dark and tried to think clearly. Margaret was systematically dismantling what her father had left behind. Whatever he had built, whatever he had intended to protect Margaret, was taking it apart piece by piece and converting it into income that had nothing to do with Abigail. And she was doing it quietly, legally, in ways that would be very difficult to challenge. The question that filled the room around her larger than all the rest was why. Margaret had the house, she had the social position, she had access to everything she'd wanted when she married Robert Carter. Why this? Why now? Why the lawyer and the midnight meetings and the contract that moved like smoke through the machinery of inheritance law? What was Margaret afraid of losing? Friday came. Abigail drove herself to the Hawthorne house, with the weight of everything she'd found pressed quiet and heavy beneath her ribs. She hadn't told anyone, not Nell, not yet. She didn't know enough, and what she didn't know, she was afraid to name out loud before she understood its shape. Nathaniel was waiting on the porch when she arrived, which surprised her. He wasn't the kind of man who waited on porches. He was the kind of man who was already occupied with the next thing and came to the door when you knocked. But he was there, standing with his arms crossed, and an expression that shifted when he saw her drive up something that moved through his face and was gone again before she could quite name it. "You look tired," he said when she came up the steps. "Good morning to you too," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Good morning. You still look tired." "I haven't been sleeping well," she admitted. It was more than she'd intended to say. She was still recalibrating to a person who asked direct questions and deserved direct answers. He studied her for a moment. "Come inside," he said. "My mother's in the garden. It'll just be us." She followed him through to the library, a room she hadn't been in on Thursday books, floor to ceiling, 2 worn leather chairs near the window, a desk that had the particular organized chaos of someone who actually worked at it rather than displayed it. He gestured to one of the chairs. She sat. He didn't sit yet. He stood near the desk, with his hands in his pockets, and looked at her with that careful, unhurried attention that she had come to recognize as simply his way. "Something happened," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But something did." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "My father's study, 2 nights ago." And she told him. Not all of it. She kept the contract vague, referenced it as documentation she'd found that concerned the estate management. But she told him about Nell and the lawyer and the midnight meeting and what she'd found in the locked drawer. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. This was another thing she had come to recognize about him. He listened the way he talked fully, without the half-attention that most people brought to conversations, the part of them already composing their response while you were still speaking. He listened until she was finished. Then he said, "Thomas Wyndham." She stared at him. "You know him. I know of him." Something shifted in his expression, something careful, controlled. "He's a financial agent out of Richmond. He represents several landowners in the region, manages investments, arranges contracts." He paused. "He also has a reputation for finding opportunities in estates that are in transition. Widows who don't fully understand what they've inherited. Properties where the legal situation is complicated." Another pause. "I've declined to do business with him twice." The room felt very still. "Why?" Abigail asked. "Because the men who work with him tend to find after a few years that the arrangements they agreed to are harder to exit than they expected." He looked at her directly. "Your father's will, do you know its contents precisely? He told me the fields were to come to me, but I've never seen the document itself." "Who has the will?" I assumed Margaret. She stopped. "I've never actually asked." "You should ask," Nathaniel said. "Or better, you should ask someone other than Margaret. A will filed with the county court is a public record. It can be obtained independently." Abigail looked at him. "You're telling me my stepmother may have altered or suppressed my father's will. I'm telling you that what you've described is consistent with a pattern I've seen before in other circumstances. I'm not telling you anything is certain." He sat down then finally in the other chair and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. I want to help you, Miss Carter. I want to be clear about that. But I need you to understand that what I'm suggesting, investigating this, challenging it legally, it will not be a quiet process. It will create conflict. It's already creating conflict, she said. Yes, he said. But right now the conflict is quiet. If you pull this thread, it becomes loud. He held her gaze. You need to be certain you want that. She thought of her father's chair, the smell of tobacco and old paper, the empty shelf where his ledgers used to be, the contract with Thomas Wyndham's name on it transferring control of the fields her father had built from drought and debt and sheer patient labor. I'm certain, she said.
Gato.
She was back in her room by late afternoon, and she had barely closed the door when she heard raised voices downstairs. Not loud. Margaret was never loud, but raised and sharp in a way that cut through the afternoon quiet with the precision of something that had been too long compressed. She stood at the top of the stairs and listened. Margaret's voice. Don't know what you think you're accomplishing. And another voice, one she hadn't expected. Eleanor Hawthorne. I'm having a conversation, Margaret. That's all I'm doing. You're interfering in family matters that have nothing to do with you. Robert Carter was a friend of mine. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice was completely infuriatingly calm. His daughter's welfare has everything to do with me. His daughter is provided for. She has a home. She has the use of a home that may not legally be hers to use depending on how the estate documents read. A pause, and when Mrs. Hawthorne continued, her voice was cooler. Harder, the pleasantness stripped away to something more structural underneath. I've engaged a solicitor, Margaret, not to threaten you, simply to understand. I think you understand what I mean by that. Silence. Abigail pressed her hand against the stair wall and stopped breathing. You have no standing, Margaret said at last. Her voice was different now. Still controlled, but the pleasantness was entirely gone. What was underneath it was not warm. You're a neighbor and a busybody, and whatever you think you know about this family's affairs. I know Thomas Wyndham, Mrs. Hawthorne said. I know what he does, and I know what it means when his name appears in a dead man's estate documents without the knowledge of that man's heir. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Then Margaret said very quietly, Get out of my house. Gladly, Mrs. Hawthorne said. I've said what I came to say. Abigail moved back from the stairwell and pressed her back against the wall of the upper landing and breathed. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were shaking she hadn't noticed until just now. Eleanor Hawthorne had come here. She had come here without warning. Abigail, without asking, without coordinating, she had simply decided and acted the way women of a certain age and a certain standing can act when they decide that patience has run its course. And Margaret had just discovered that the Hawthorne family was paying attention. The front door opened and closed. A long, terrible silence from below. Then the sound of heels on the floor, precise, controlled, moving toward the study. And then, nothing. Abigail stood on the landing for a full minute before her legs felt solid enough to trust. She went back to her room. She sat at her small desk. She took out a piece of paper. She wasn't sure what she was going to write until she wrote it. But when she was done, she read it back once, and it was the most honest thing she had put into words in 3 years. Nathaniel. She knows. She knows you're involved or suspects it. Whatever is going to happen, I think it will happen soon. I am not frightened. I want you to know that. But I also want you to know that whatever is in my father's records, whatever the truth is, I need to find it before she destroys it. If you have any way to help me move faster, I am asking. Abigail. She folded it. She sealed it. She found the Hawthorne boy in the lane the next morning, the way she had twice before, and she sent it. Then she went back inside and waited. She had learned to wait. 3 years of practice. But this was a different kind of waiting, not the passive endurance of someone with no choices, but the coiled, intentional waiting of someone who has made a decision and is holding herself ready for the moment it becomes action. Margaret came to breakfast that morning with her face perfectly arranged and her voice perfectly pleasant, and said nothing about Eleanor Hawthorne or lawyers or Thomas Wyndham or anything at all. She talked about the weather. She talked about the Whitmore family's upcoming engagement party. She reminded Dorothea to practice her pianoforte, and she watched Abigail across the table with eyes that had gone flat and cold and entirely unreadable. Abigail passed the butter when it was asked for and kept her face neutral, and understood with complete clarity that the war between them had just changed. It was no longer quiet and one-sided. Margaret knew she was being investigated. Margaret knew the Hawthorns were involved. And Margaret, who was a woman who planned ahead and feared losing what she had above almost anything else, was not going to wait patiently for things to unfold around her. She was going to move first. The only question was how and how fast. And then 3 days later, the question was answered in the worst possible way. Margaret came to Abigail's room in the evening unannounced, and she sat down in the chair by the window with the calm of someone who has already decided something, and she said, "Your father was not the man you think he was, Abigail." Abigail went very still. "I've protected you from this," Margaret said. "I've protected this family's name from this for 3 years. But if you're going to involve outside parties in our private affairs, then you deserve to know the truth." She folded her hands. "Your father was in significant financial trouble when he died. He had debts he'd concealed from everyone, including me. He had entered into arrangements, business arrangements, that were not entirely legitimate." She paused. "There are documents, letters, records of transactions that would be very damaging to his reputation if they became public." "I don't believe you," Abigail said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "I know," Margaret said gently, as if this was sad. "You loved him, I understand. But love doesn't change facts." She stood. "The Hawthorns are a powerful family, Abigail. If you bring them into this, and the truth about your father comes out through legal proceedings, it won't just damage his name, it will damage yours, and theirs by association." She moved toward the door. "I'm telling you this as your mother." "You are not my mother," Abigail said. The words came out quiet and final, like a door being shut. Margaret paused in the doorway. Something moved across her face, something that for the briefest fraction of a second looked almost like respect. "No," she said. "I'm not." And she left. Abigail sat with that for a long time. She believed her father. She believed him completely and without reservation, the way you believe a thing that is built into the structure of who you are. But she understood also what Margaret had just done. She had planted a seed. She had put the possibility of doubt into the air where it would sit and wait to do its slow damage to Abigail's certainty, to Nathaniel's involvement, to whatever was being built between the Carter name and the Hawthorne family, in the careful and cautious way that fragile things get built. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. She was reaching for the one thing that could still stop all of this. Not Abigail's courage, not Nathaniel's resources, not Eleanor Hawthorne's determination. Her love for her father. The doubt arrived the next morning quietly, the way doubts always do not. As a shout, but as a whisper repeating itself in the spaces between tasks, asking, "What if, what if, what if?" She pressed it down. She went about her work. She pressed butter and mended linen and helped Nell with the kitchen garden, and the whole time the whisper ran underneath everything, like water under floorboards. What if there were things her father had never told her? What if the man she had loved and trusted and built her entire understanding of the world around had been something other than what she'd believed? By evening, she had not answered the whisper, but she had made a decision. She needed to find her father's records. The real ones. Not what Margaret had left in the study, not the carefully edited version of his paper trail that began and ended at the moment most convenient to Margaret's purposes. The real records. Letters, ledgers, anything that showed who Robert Carter had actually been and what he had actually done. And she had 6 days before the next major Whitmore social event, after which Abigail had learned from Nell that Margaret had a planned meeting in Richmond with Thomas Wyndham. 6 days. She went to her desk and took out a new piece of paper, and this time she wrote to Nathaniel not with questions, but with a plan. Nathaniel's reply came before dawn. Not through the Hawthorne boy this time. He brought it himself, which she discovered when Nell appeared at her bedroom door in the gray, early light and said quietly, "He's at the back gate, miss. Says he won't come in unless you ask him to, but he'd like to speak with you." Abigail was dressed and downstairs in 4 minutes. He was standing at the gate exactly as Nell had described, not leaning on it, not pacing, just standing with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the lane, the way a man stands when he's made a decision and is waiting to find out if it was the right one. He turned when he heard her come down the path, and even in the thin morning light, she could see that he hadn't slept. "You got my letter," she said. "Last night, late." He looked at her steadily. "I came as soon as it was a decent hour, or close to it." A pause. "I apologize for the hour." "Don't," she said. "Tell me what you know." He told her. He had heard the name Thomas Wyndham, not twice as he'd said before, but 3 times, and the 3rd time had been in a context he hadn't mentioned, because he hadn't been certain it was relevant. It was relevant. A man named Charles Aldridge, a tobacco merchant out of Fredericksburg, had engaged Wyndham 4 years ago to manage a disputed inheritance following his father's death. Within 18 months, the estate's productive assets had been transferred to a partnership in which Wyndham held a silent interest. The family had tried to challenge it through the county court, and found to their considerable distress that every document was in order, perfectly impenetrably in order. "He constructs these arrangements so they're technically legal," Nathaniel said. "That's the architecture of it. Everything is signed, everything is notarized, everything looks like an ordinary business arrangement until you understand the whole of what's been done." "And Margaret brought him in 6 months after my father died," Abigail said. "Yes. Which means she knew about him before my father died. Or she found him very quickly after." Something moved through Nathaniel's expression. Not surprised she was learning that very little surprised him, but a kind of grim confirmation. "That's the question I'd want answered," he said. "When did Margaret Carter first contact Thomas Wyndham? Because if it was before your father's death, the implications are considerably more serious than estate fraud." The morning air between them held that sentence for a moment without either of them touching it. "My father kept records," Abigail said. "Nell told me. Everything contracts letters, business correspondence. Margaret has cleared the study, but Nell says she thinks there may be a secondary set. My father had a lockbox. He kept it at Hargrove's store in town. The proprietor was an old friend, they'd known each other 30 years. Margaret wouldn't have known about it." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Does Hargrove still have it?" "I don't know. I haven't asked. I was afraid to ask the wrong person in the wrong order." She looked at him. "I need to go to town today. Margaret is taking the girls to the Whitmore estate until evening. I have until sundown. But I need someone who can read legal documents faster than I can and tell me what I'm actually looking at." "I'll come with you," he said, without hesitation, without calculation. Just the flat certainty of a man who has decided. "If someone sees us, then someone sees us." He met her eyes. "Miss Carter, Abigail." The use of her given name was deliberate and careful, and she felt it register somewhere precise in her chest. "Whatever this costs socially, I'm not concerned about it. I'm concerned about what happens to you if Wyndham completes whatever he and Margaret are building before we understand its full scope." He paused. "Are you going to argue with me about this?" She considered it. "No," she said. "Good." He settled his hat back on his head. "Give me an hour to arrange things. I'll meet you at the crossroads." Hargrove's store sat on the main street of town, and had for 30 years weathered and solid and smelling of sawdust and tobacco and the particular accumulated history of a building that has served as the center of a community's commerce and gossip for longer than most of its customers had been alive. Edmund Hargrove was 70, white-haired, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned that most things worth doing were worth doing slowly. He looked at Abigail over his counter with an expression that was both unsurprised and deeply careful. "Miss Carter," he said, "I wondered when you'd come." "You knew I'd come." "Your father told me before he passed that you would eventually." He looked past her at Nathaniel, assessed him with a quick, thorough glance, seemed to make a decision. "Mr. Hawthorne, I know your family." "Mr. Hargrove." Nathaniel inclined his head. "I'm here in Miss Carter's interest, not my own." Hargrove studied him a moment longer. Then he reached under the counter and produced a key. "The box is in the back. It's been there 4 years. I told no one about it. Your father was clear on that point. He said nobody but Abigail, and only when she asks for it herself." He looked at her. "You're asking." "I'm asking," she said. The lockbox was medium-sized, plain iron-heavy. She carried it herself to the table in the back room, and Nathaniel stood beside her while she fitted the small key her father had given her years ago, the one she'd worn on a cord around her neck since his death, not knowing what it opened, but understanding that it mattered, into the lock. It opened. Inside was her father's real record of the last 2 years of his life. She understood that within the first 5 minutes of reading. Nathaniel read beside her faster than she did, occasionally pointing to a passage without speaking, letting her find the meaning herself. What they assembled between them over the next 40 minutes was a picture of Robert Carter that was nothing like the one Margaret had tried to build. Her father had not been in financial trouble. He had been in possession of evidence of a financial crime. The records were meticulous. That was Robert Carter. That was the man she knew. Nothing imprecise, nothing left to interpretation. He had discovered through an ordinary business transaction with a land broker in Richmond that Thomas Wyndham was operating a systematic scheme. He was identifying wealthy widows and women who had inherited property they didn't fully understand how to manage, inserting himself as an agent, constructing arrangements that transferred productive assets into his partnerships, and collecting income from those assets for years, while the original families received a smaller and smaller share of what was rightfully theirs. He had done it to at least 6 families that Robert Carter had been able to document. He had been doing it for a decade. Robert Carter had been building a case. He had been corresponding with a lawyer in Richmond, a man named James Beckett, who had agreed to bring the matter before the court once the documentation was complete. He had died before the documentation was complete, and Margaret, who had married him 14 months before his death, who had come into the house with her daughters and her social ambitions and her perfectly calibrated pleasantness. Margaret had known Thomas Wyndham before she married Robert Carter. There was a letter dated 6 months before the wedding, in Wyndham's hand, addressed to Margaret Whitfield at her previous address. It was brief and businesslike, and it referred to an arrangement they had discussed regarding a future opportunity in the Carter estate. 6 months before the wedding. Abigail set the letter down on the table. The room was very quiet. "She married him for this," Abigail said. The words came out flat and strange, like something she was trying to hear herself say. "She married my father because Wyndham had identified the estate as a target, and she was the mechanism," Nathaniel said quietly. "Yes. She was in the house. She had access. She managed things after he died because she was the widow, and it was expected and nobody questioned it." Her voice was steady. She was distantly surprised by how steady it was. She didn't just take advantage of his death. She was positioned for it. Nathaniel said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. He stood beside her with his hands flat on the table and let her hold the weight of it. She held it for a long moment. Then she said, "The lawyer, James Beckett, in Richmond. If my father was corresponding with him." "He may have copies," Nathaniel said. "Your father would have sent duplicates. He was careful." "He was very careful," she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Just slightly. She pulled it back. "We need to contact Beckett before Margaret goes to Richmond, before she meets with Wyndham next week." She looked at Nathaniel. "Can you do that? Send someone to Richmond today?" "I can go myself," he said. "That's too visible. Margaret will hear you've gone to Richmond, and she'll know something is happening." He looked at her with that expression she'd come to recognize, the one that was not quite a smile, but carried the same quality. "You're thinking 3 moves ahead. I'm thinking about the fact that she's had 4 years to build this, and we have 6 days." She carefully repacked the documents. Send someone you trust. Not a servant, someone with standing. Someone Beckett will speak to. My cousin William is in Richmond, Nathaniel said. He's a physician, not a lawyer, but he has standing, and he knows how to be discreet. I'll write to him today. A pause. Abigail. There's something else. She looked up. If Beckett has copies, and I believe he does because your father clearly intended this to proceed, then what we're bringing to court isn't just a civil matter about the estate. He held her gaze. What your father documented is criminal fraud. Multiple counts, multiple families over a decade. Wyndham will face criminal prosecution. And Margaret? He stopped. Margaret was complicit, Abigail said. Yes. From before the marriage? Yes. She closed the lockbox. She locked it. She held the key in her hand for a moment. Then that's what we bring to court, she said. She was home before sundown, the lockbox hidden under the gig's seat. Her face arranged in the neutral expression she had perfected over 3 years. Nell met her at the back door and looked at her with the sharp-eyed attention of a woman who knows when something significant has happened and is waiting to understand how significant. Margaret's back, Nell said quietly. Earlier than expected. Abigail's step didn't falter. All right. She asked where you'd been. What did you tell her? That you'd gone to town for thread. Nell paused. It wasn't a lie. You did buy thread. Thank you, Nell. She had the lockbox upstairs and under her bed before Margaret appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. Her stepmother looked at her with those flat, unreadable eyes and said, You went to town. I needed thread, Abigail said. She began setting the table for supper, moving efficiently, not hurrying. The blue is nearly finished. You drove yourself. The gig was available. A pause. You've been driving yourself a great deal lately. It's more convenient, Abigail said. Margaret stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then she said, The Whitmore party is Saturday. I'll need you to help Dorothea with her hair again. Of course, Abigail said. The evening proceeded with a normalcy so complete it was almost painful supper. The girls' conversation about the Whitmore family's guests, Margaret's precise and pleasant social management of the table, Nell moving quietly between kitchen and dining room. And underneath all of it, in the space beneath the ordinary surface of things, the lockbox under Abigail's bed, and the letter from Thomas Wyndham dated 6 months before her father's wedding, and the whole careful criminal architecture that Margaret and her partner had built over years. She slept, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake with it all running through her mind, but she slept the deep, flat sleep of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has finally set it down. In the morning, she wrote to Nathaniel. Short, careful. It's all there. Send William. She gave it to Nell, who knew a way to get things to the Hawthorne estate without going through the front gate. Abigail did not ask how. She trusted Nell the way she trusted a few essential things in her life completely, on the basis of evidence accumulated over years. 3 days passed. On the 3rd day, the letter from Richmond arrived. Not addressed to her, it came to the Hawthorne house from William Hawthorne, and Nathaniel wrote it over himself rather than sending the boy. She met him at the back gate again, the way she'd begun to think of as their place, the specific geography of their particular situation, not the front, not inside, but the edge, the margin, the gate between the house and the road. He handed her the letter without preamble. Read the 2nd paragraph. She read it. James Beckett, the Richmond lawyer, had not only maintained copies of Robert Carter's documentation, he had been waiting. He had understood when Robert Carter died suddenly that the case was not finished, and he had held the materials and waited because Robert Carter had told him that his daughter would come eventually. The same thing Hargrove had said. The same certainty repeated across the distance of 4 years. Her father had known he was building something that might outlive his ability to finish it. He had planned for the possibility. He had left breadcrumbs not for Margaret to find, but for Abigail, the key around her neck, the lockbox, at Hargrove's, the lawyer in Richmond, holding the duplicate case file and waiting for the daughter to arrive. She stood at the gate with the letter in her hands and felt something that was too large and too complicated for one emotion, grief and love and fury, and something that was almost gratitude. The terrible gratitude of understanding that someone who loved you had done everything they could to protect you, even from beyond the reach of their own life. "He knew," she said. Her voice was barely a voice. He knew something was wrong. He knew it might happen before he could stop it. "Yes," Nathaniel said quietly. He was standing close enough that she could have leaned against him if she'd let herself. She didn't. But she was aware of the distance between them as a presence rather than an absence, the specific warmth of someone who is near and means to be. "The Whitmore party is Saturday," she said, pulling herself back. "Margaret is in that room in that social world, and she still thinks she's 3 steps ahead of everything. She still thinks she's managing this." "She's about to find out otherwise," Nathaniel said. "Beckett? Can he be in Virginia by Saturday?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "William says he's willing. He's been willing for 4 years. A pause. "He said," and William said this with some feeling that he would have come sooner if anyone had asked. She almost smiled. The pressure of it moved through her chest. "Then we ask him now." "There's one more thing," Nathaniel said. She looked up at him. "The other families, the ones your father documented. Beckett has been in contact with 2 of them. They've been waiting too. They suspected what had happened to their estates, but had no evidence and no standing to challenge it alone." He held her gaze. "You won't be bringing this case by yourself, Abigail. There are other women who lost what their families built. Beckett intends to bring the full scope of it to court. What you found in that lockbox is the piece that makes the whole case viable." She absorbed that. "My father built the foundation," she said. "Yes." "And we're going to finish it." "Yes," he said. And then more quietly, "You're going to finish it. I'll stand beside you, but this is yours." She looked at him. This man who had crossed a ballroom for reasons he hadn't needed to have, who had listened when she pushed back, who had come to her back gate before dawn, who had sent his cousin to Richmond and ridden over himself with a letter rather than send a boy, and who stood here now telling her clearly that what she was about to do was hers, not his. Hers. "Why?" she asked. The same question she'd asked on the dance floor. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because your father was an honest man who tried to do the right thing and ran out of time," he said, "and because you are his daughter in every way that matters." A pause. "And because I have been paying very close attention for the past 3 weeks, and I am not a man who ignores what he sees." The morning was quiet around them. Somewhere down the lane, a bird was singing, with the particular bright persistence of a creature that has no idea the world contains problems. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he confirmed. "She'll fight it," Abigail said. "Margaret, she won't simply—" "No," he agreed. "She won't. It will be ugly, and it will be public, and she will say every damaging thing she can think of before it's over." He held her gaze. "Are you ready for that?" Abigail thought about the dress. The faded, yellowed, cedar-smelling dress. The column she had stood against. The whispers that had moved through the room like water moving downhill, finding every low place. Eleanor Dorsey's cold smile. The 3 years of quiet, systematic diminishment. The lockbox full of her father's careful, meticulous, loving attempt to protect her. "I've been ready for 3 years," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." Nathaniel looked at her with something in his eyes that was not pity and not principle. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. He didn't say it. He wasn't a man who said things before they were certain. But it was there, and she felt it, and she tucked it somewhere inside her and kept it. "Go home," he said. "Let Margaret think everything is ordinary. 2 more days." 2 more days, she said. She walked back up the path toward the house. At the kitchen door, she paused and looked back. He was still at the gate, watching her go, making sure she got inside safely, the smallest, quietest, most unnecessary gesture of care, and somehow the most real thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. She went inside. She helped Dorothea with her hair. She passed the butter at supper. She said goodnight to Margaret with the same neutral, careful pleasantness she had maintained for 3 years. And she went to bed with the lockbox underneath it and her father's key around her neck, and the absolute certain knowledge that in 2 days, in the middle of Virginia's most attended summer social gathering, everything Margaret Carter had built on the foundation of Robert Carter's death was going to come down, and Abigail was going to be the one who brought it down. Saturday arrived the way important days always do, without fanfare, without any signal that this particular morning was different from any other. The sun coming up the same as it always had over the Virginia fields, and the birds doing their business, and the house waking in its usual sequence of small sounds. Abigail was already awake. She had been awake since 4, not from anxiety, but from a kind of clean, clear alertness that had settled into her sometime in the night and replaced the weight she'd been carrying with something sharper and more purposeful. She lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe, and thought about her father the way she always did when something was about to change, and she told him quietly in the privacy of her own mind that she was going to finish what he started, that she was sorry it had taken this long, that she understood now why he had done what he did, the lockbox, the lawyer, the careful distributed trail of evidence meant to outlast him, and that she was not going to waste it. Then she got up, dressed herself in the best dress she owned, the blue one she had made herself from honest fabric bought with honest money, and she went downstairs to help with breakfast. Margaret noticed the dress immediately. She noticed it the way she noticed everything quickly, without appearing to filing it away behind her pleasant expression. She said nothing. She poured her coffee and discussed the Whitmore party's expected attendance and reminded her daughters to behave with appropriate decorum, and she watched Abigail across the breakfast table with those flat measuring eyes. Abigail passed the bread and met her stepmother's gaze and held it for exactly 1 second longer than she normally would. Margaret looked away first. It was such a small thing, barely a thing at all. But Abigail felt it like a door opening inward. The Whitmore estate was the largest private property in the county, and the late summer party was its crowning social event. The gathering that everyone attended, because not attending was a statement no one in Virginia's planter society could afford to make. By the time Margaret's carriage arrived, the grounds were already full of the sound of voices and music and the particular bright energy of a community that had dressed itself in its finest and come out to be seen. Abigail stepped down from the carriage and looked across the gathered crowd. She found Nathaniel in under 10 seconds. He was standing near the far end of the main hall's entrance, and he was not alone. Beside him stood a man she didn't recognize, middle-aged, compact, with a lawyer's careful eyes, and a satchel under his arm that she recognized immediately. James Beckett had come from Richmond. Beside Beckett stood Eleanor Hawthorne, upright and composed, and wearing the expression of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this moment and is prepared to enjoy it without the slightest appearance of enjoying it. And beside Eleanor, to Abigail's considerable surprise, stood 2 women she had never met, one perhaps 51, closer to her own age, both of them watching the crowd with the particular watchfulness of people who have come somewhere with a purpose and are holding it close. The other families, the ones her father had documented. Beckett had brought witnesses. Nathaniel saw her across the distance and gave the smallest, most contained nod she had ever seen, and she returned it with equal economy, and Margaret, who was greeting the Whitmore matriarch 6 feet away, did not see any of it. She found Nell's cousin, a woman named Grace, who worked in the Whitmore kitchens exactly where Nell had said she would be, near the side entrance, waiting with a folded note. The note was from Nathaniel. 3 words. Beckett is ready. She folded it into her palm and went inside. The first hour was the hardest. She moved through the gathering, the way she had always moved through these events, purposefully, quietly speaking when spoken to, smiling when it was called for, maintaining the careful, neutral performance that had kept her safe and invisible for 3 years. She watched Margaret work the room with the smooth efficiency of a woman in her element. the right word for every person, the right level of warmth and deference, calibrated perfectly to each individual's social standing. Margaret was extraordinary at this. Abigail had always known that. Whatever else she was, Margaret Carter was a masterclass in social management. Eleanor Dorsey found her at the refreshment table because Eleanor Dorsey always found her at refreshment tables apparently. "Miss Carter." She looked at the blue dress with an expression that was trying to be dismissive and not quite landing it. "You look different today." "Thank you," Abigail said pleasantly, as if it had been a compliment. Eleanor opened her mouth and closed it again. Then, with the instinct of a woman who has sensed something shifting in the architecture of a gathering without being able to identify what is something happening today. "It's a party," Abigail said. "I believe things are always happening." She moved away before Eleanor could respond. Across the room, she could see Beckett speaking quietly with the Whitmore family's patriarch, George Whitmore, who was listening with his arms crossed and an expression of increasing gravity. Eleanor Hawthorne was nearby, not part of the conversation, but positioned close enough to be visible. Her presence a kind of endorsement saying, without words, that the Hawthorne family considered this serious. The two women from Richmond stood together near the windows. The older one caught Abigail's eye across the room and held her gaze for a moment with an expression that she felt in her sternum. Recognition. Solidarity. The particular look of a woman who has been waiting to be believed about something for a long time and is close enough to the moment now that she can almost breathe normally again. Abigail crossed the room to her. "Mrs. Aldridge," she asked, because the name was in her father's documents. Charles Aldridge's widow, the woman whose estate had been the first Wyndham had targeted. "Yes." The woman took her hand and held it rather than shaking it. "You must be Robert Carter's daughter." "I am. He wrote about you," Mrs. Aldridge said, "in the correspondence he had with Beckett. He said you would find it eventually, that you were stubborn and careful, and that you would find it." Her voice caught slightly on the last words. "I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry we didn't find each other sooner." "We found each other now," Abigail said. Margaret was deep in conversation with two women from the county's most prominent family when George Whitmore crossed the room toward her, and she didn't see it coming. Abigail watched from 20 feet away and understood that this was the moment, the precise point at which the evening divided into before and after. Whitmore spoke to her quietly. Margaret listened. Her expression didn't change for the first several seconds, which was a testament to her considerable self-control. Then something shifted, a slight tightening around her eyes, a fractional change in the set of her jaw, and she turned her head slowly and scanned the room. She found Beckett first, then Eleanor Hawthorne, then the two women from Richmond, then Abigail. Their eyes met across the width of the room, and in that moment, every careful, pleasant layer that Margaret Carter had maintained for 4 years simply fell away. What was underneath was not what Abigail had expected. She had expected anger. Cold fury, the kind Margaret wielded like a precision instrument. What she saw instead was fear. Raw and real and human. The fear of a woman who has spent years building a structure against a particular kind of fall, and can now feel it tilting. Margaret excused herself from the conversation with a murmured word and moved toward Abigail with the directness of someone who has decided that the only remaining option is confrontation. "What have you done?" she said quietly. Her voice was still controlled. "Barely. I found my father's records," Abigail said. She kept her own voice low and even. "All of them. Including his correspondence with James Beckett in Richmond. Including the letter from Thomas Wyndham addressed to Margaret Whitfield 6 months before your wedding." Margaret's face went completely still. "He knew what you were," Abigail said. Not with anger, she had moved past anger sometime in the past 2 days into something cleaner and colder. "He knew what you and Wyndham were planning. He was building a case against you, and he ran out of time." A pause. "I finished it." "You don't understand what you've started," Margaret said. Her voice had dropped further tighter, the pleasantness entirely gone. "These people, this county, They will not simply. Mr. Beckett has 7 families' documentation, Abigail said, including ours, including the Aldridge family. He has been in contact with the county sheriff and a judge in Richmond. The complaint has already been filed. She watched Margaret absorb this. There is nothing left to manage, Margaret. It's done. Margaret stared at her. Something crossed her face that Abigail had never seen there before. Not a performance, not a calculation, but something real and broken at the edges. It lasted only a second. Then Margaret Carter, who had controlled every room she had ever entered, looked away. "You'll destroy your father's name doing this," she said. But the words were hollow. She knew they were hollow. She was saying them because she had nothing else left. "My father's name is on the documents that expose this crime," Abigail said quietly. "His name is the reason any of this is possible. You spent 4 years trying to make people forget who Robert Carter was. Today, everyone in this county is going to remember." Margaret said nothing. Around them, the party continued its bright surface noise, unaware that the most significant exchange of the evening had just happened in low voices near the windows between 2 women who had lived in the same house for 3 years and never once been honest with each other until now. George Whitmore addressed the gathering 20 minutes later quietly, and with the gravity of a man who takes his community's welfare seriously. He did not make a spectacle of it. He explained that a matter of significant legal concern had been brought to his attention, that James Beckett of Richmond was present to speak with anyone who wished to understand the details, and that the sheriff had been informed and would be calling on certain parties in the coming days. The room absorbed this in the particular way that rooms full of Virginia society people absorbed unexpected information with an outward calm that covered furious internal calculation. Margaret had not moved from the window. Thomas Wyndham. Abigail learned later had been expected at the Whitmore party that evening. He had been due to arrive at 7. He did not arrive. The sheriff's deputy who went to his Richmond address found it vacated. He had learned through some channel that none of them could immediately identify that the situation had broken. He had fled rather than face it. Margaret, when the deputy arrived to speak with her, stood very straight and very still, and said she wished to speak with a lawyer before saying anything further. It was the most dignified thing Abigail had ever seen her do, and she felt watching it the complicated grief of someone who understands that a person who did a terrible thing is still a person. Then she let it go. She had carried enough for Margaret Carter. She was done carrying things that didn't belong to her. Nathaniel found her outside on the far side of the property, where she had gone when the room became too full of noise and movement, and the weight of everything that had just shifted. She was standing with her back to the house, her face toward the fields, breathing. She heard his step behind her and didn't turn. He came to stand beside her, not too close, maintaining the careful distance they had always maintained, and he was quiet for a moment, which was his way, giving things the space they needed before he spoke into them. "It held," he said. "It held," she agreed. "Beckett has everything he needs. The other families will be filing their own complaints separately, but your father's documentation is the backbone of the whole case." A pause. "He built something extraordinary, Abigail. In the time he had with what he knew the case he constructed was," he stopped, started again. "He was trying to protect you. All of it was trying to protect you." She breathed. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge asked me to tell you something," he said. She said that when she read your father's letters, she understood that he knew he might not finish it himself, and that he wrote in the last letter to Beckett that his daughter would come. He wrote it like he was certain." The evening light was long and golden across the tobacco fields. She had grown up watching that light move across those fields late summer, the best time, the time her father loved most. "He was certain," she said. "He knew me." "Yes," Nathaniel said softly. "He did." She turned to look at him then. He was watching her with that expression she had been carefully not naming for the past 3 weeks, the one that was not pity and not principle and not the considered interest of a man assessing a situation. It was simpler than any of those things and larger than all of them, and she had been keeping it at a careful distance because she hadn't been ready for it, and because there was work to do, and because allowing herself to want something for herself had felt for a very long time like a luxury she couldn't afford. "You've been very careful," she said, "not to say certain things." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you had something to finish. And it wasn't mine to put myself in the middle of until it was finished." A pause. "It's finished." She looked at him. "Say it then." He was quiet for a long moment. Not hesitation, she understood his silences now, the different kinds of them. This one was the kind where he was choosing the exact right words, because he was a man who said what he meant, and meant exactly what he said. "I have spent 2 years," he said, "not paying attention to people. Not because I didn't care, but because caring had cost me considerably, and I wasn't prepared to do it again carelessly." He held her gaze. "And then I walked into Governor Randolph's ballroom and saw a woman standing against a wall in a dress someone had chosen to humiliate her and holding herself like she was the most dignified person in the room." He paused. "I paid attention. I haven't stopped since." "Nathaniel," she said. "I'm not finished," he said, and there was the ghost of that almost smile. "I want to be clear, because I think you deserve clarity, and I am trying to be a better man than I have been in the past 2 years. I am not asking you to need me. I am not asking you to be grateful. I'm asking whether you have any interest in building something with a person who pays attention, who will not manage you, or diminish you, or put you in a dress designed to make you small." He stopped. "That's all I'm asking." The evening was very quiet around them. She thought about the ballroom, and the dress, and the column she had stood against, and the 3 years of careful endurance that had taught her what she was made of. She thought about the lockbox and her father's key around her neck, and the letter in Beckett's satchel that would clear Robert Carter's name in every room in Virginia. She thought about the blue dress she was wearing today, made with her own hands the color of the James River in late evening. She thought about a man who had crossed a room for no reason except that he had seen her. "I have an interest," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his coat and took out a ring. Small, plain gold, not elaborate, the kind of ring a man chooses when he is thinking about the woman and not the performance of the gesture. He held it in his palm between them. "I don't need an answer tonight," he said. "I want you to understand that. You have just dismantled 4 years of someone else's construction, and you deserve time to know what your own life looks like before you make decisions about it." He held her gaze. "But I want you to have this, so you know I'm serious. So you know I'm not asking from principle or pity or any other reason than the one that is simply you." She looked at the ring in his palm. She looked at his face. Tired, honest, wearing its feelings plainly, for once the way he'd worn everything else she'd come to know about him. She picked up the ring. She held it in her own hand for a moment, feeling its weight. Slight. Real. "Ask me properly," she said. Something moved through his face. Genuine, unguarded, the expression of a man who was not expecting that, and was deeply glad of it. He looked at the ring in her hand. He looked at her face. And then Nathaniel Hawthorne, the most composed man Abigail Carter had ever met, took a breath that was slightly unsteady and said, "Abigail Carter, will you marry me?" She was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. Just one, just the single breath of a man who has been holding something tight for a long time and is only now allowing himself to put it down. She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. Of course it fit. He was a man who paid attention. Inside the house, the Whitmore party continued its complicated, loud restructuring evening. The conversation shifting and rippling with the news about Wyndham and Margaret, and the Carter estate voices rising and falling in the ongoing work that communities do when something they thought was solid turns out to have been built on constructed ground. There would be months of legal process ahead. There would be Beckett's court filings, and the Richmond proceedings, and the depositions of 7 families, and the slow, thorough work of dismantling what Wyndham had built over a decade. There would be mornings when the weight of all of it would press back down, and complications she couldn't yet anticipate, and the long, patient labor of restoring what her father had spent his life building. She knew all of that. She held it clearly. She also held the ring on her finger, and the evening air, and the man standing beside her, who had offered her exactly what he'd said. Not rescue, not management, not the comfortable diminishment of being someone's project. Partnership. Attention. The simple, extraordinary offer of being seen clearly by someone who chose with full knowledge of what they were seeing to stay. Mrs. Aldridge came out a few minutes later with the younger woman beside her, and she looked at Abigail's hand, and she smiled the smile of a woman who has carried a grief for a long time, and is finally carefully beginning to set it down. "Your father would have been insufferable about this," Mrs. Aldridge said. Abigail laughed. Actually laughed fully, the sound of it surprising her with how unguarded it was. "He would have said he knew all along." "He probably did know all along," Nathaniel said dryly. "He left a key around my neck for 4 years," Abigail said. "He absolutely knew." Eleanor Hawthorne emerged last with the timing of a woman who manages these things deliberately, and she looked at her son, and then at Abigail, and then at the ring, and she said nothing at all for a long moment. Then she reached out and took Abigail's hand in both of hers, the way she had the very first night, firm, direct, without ceremony. "Welcome," she said. That was all. Just the one word spoken like it was everything. And it was. The Carter estate was restored in full through the court proceedings that concluded the following spring. Thomas Wyndham was found in Georgia and brought back to face criminal charges in Richmond. He pled to reduced counts to avoid trial and received a sentence that satisfied nobody entirely, which was, Beckett told Abigail, how justice usually worked imperfect, hard-won, better than nothing. Margaret Carter left Virginia before the proceedings concluded. She went to family in Georgia, and Abigail did not know, and eventually stopped wondering what kind of life she built there. She had spent enough of herself thinking about Margaret. She was done. She and Nathaniel were married in September in the small church where her parents had married, with Nell in the front row, and Mrs. Aldridge beside her, and James Beckett making his first appearance at a social event that was not a legal proceeding. Eleanor Hawthorne cried, which she would have denied if pressed. They lived at the Hawthorne house, and the Carter fields were managed by a foreman. Abigail chose herself, and she visited them every week, walking the rows of tobacco in the long golden afternoon, doing what her father had always done, listening to the land, learning what it needed, being present to it. She wore the blue dress to the wedding, not to make a point, not as a statement, simply because it was hers, made by her own hands from fabric bought with honest money, the color of the James River, in late evening, and because she had made it for herself, and it fit exactly right, and she had never needed anyone else's approval to know that. She had learned in the end the thing her father had tried to tell her when she was 12 years old, and crying about a small injustice she could no longer remember. The world will try to convince you that endurance is the same as acceptance. Don't let it. She hadn't let it.